There are moments when a map is not just ink on paper or pixels on a screen. It becomes a warning. A quiet one at first, then louder with every passing year, until it feels less like information and more like an alarm that no one fully wants to hear. This is one of those maps. It does not show borders between nations or trade routes across oceans. It shows something far less comfortable, the probability of extreme weather events stretching across a century. Hurricanes that once felt rare are now plotted with unsettling frequency. Flood zones expand beyond what older generations were taught was safe. Heat waves spread across regions that once considered themselves temperate and protected. And the most troubling part is not what the map shows today, but what it implies for tomorrow. A 100-year storm used to mean something simple in public understanding, a once-in-a-lifetime event, a statistical outlier, a freak occurrence that could be safely ignored in everyday planning. But this map quietly dismantles that assumption. It suggests that the language itself has become outdated. What was once rare is now becoming routine in certain regions. What was once unimaginable is now being recalculated as plausible within decades, or even sooner. The unsettling truth is that the atmosphere does not remember how we used to define it. It responds only to conditions, warming oceans, shifting air currents, intensified evaporation cycles, and disrupted seasonal patterns. As these conditions change, so too does the behavior of storms. They are not simply stronger, they are becoming more erratic, more persistent, and more capable of overlapping impacts. Wind, rain, flooding, and storm surge, all arriving with greater intensity and less predictability. Look closely at the map, and a pattern begins to emerge. Coastal regions once marked with occasional risk now appear saturated with repeated high-impact zones. Inland areas, previously considered safe from tropical systems, now show corridors of vulnerability. River basins that historically absorbed seasonal variation are flagged for potential overflow events that strain infrastructure never designed for such extremes. What makes this especially alarming is not a single storm event, but the clustering of them. The map does not just warn of one catastrophe. It suggests a reshaping of baseline conditions. The new normal is not calm, punctuated by disaster. It is a rising floor of instability where extremes become part of the expected background. For cities, this is a design crisis. Roads, bridges, drainage systems, and power grids were largely built on assumptions drawn from a different climate reality. When those assumptions shift, infrastructure does not slowly adapt, it fails suddenly. A drainage system designed for a once-in-a-century rainfall does not politely overflow, it collapses under pressure. A coastal barrier designed for historic tide levels does not negotiate with higher storm surges, it is overtopped. For communities, the implications are even more direct. Homes built in areas once labeled low risk may find themselves in newly reclassified danger zones. Insurance models struggle to keep pace with rapidly changing data. Emergency systems, already stretched in many regions, face the challenge of responding to events that arrive more frequently and with less warning. And yet, perhaps the most difficult aspect of this map is psychological. Human beings are remarkably good at normalizing risk when it arrives gradually. A flood that happens once in a generation feels like history. A flood that happens twice in a decade begins to feel like coincidence. But when patterns tighten and accelerate, the mind struggles to adjust its internal definition of what is normal. The danger is not only in the storms themselves, but in the delay between changing reality and updated perception. There is also a deeper layer interconnected risk. A single storm today does not remain local. It affects supply chains, agriculture, energy distribution, and communication systems far beyond its physical footprint. A disrupted port affects global shipping. A damaged crop region affects food prices across continents. A power grid failure cascades into economic and social instability. The map, in essence, is not just showing weather, it is revealing vulnerability in systems built on stability that may no longer exist. Still, the purpose of such a map is not to create despair. It is to remove illusion. Because only when assumptions are corrected can meaningful preparation begin. Infrastructure can be redesigned. Emergency response systems can be strengthened. Urban planning can shift toward resilience rather than reaction. Early warning systems can become more precise, and communities can be better informed about the real risks they face. The storms themselves are not surprises in a scientific sense. They follow physics, patterns, and probabilities. What changes is human readiness. The gap between knowledge and action is where most damage occurs. This map, in its most honest interpretation, is not a prophecy of doom. It is a measure of exposure, a visualization of how much of our built world is still calibrated to a climate that is no longer fully present. It asks a difficult question without speaking it aloud. What happens when rare events stop being rare? And the answer is not found in fear, but in adaptation. Because every marker on that map is also a decision point, a chance to reinforce, to redesign, to rethink how communities live with water, wind, heat, and uncertainty. The storms will continue to come. That part is not in question. What remains in question is how prepared the world will be when the next line on that map becomes reality instead of prediction. 100-year storms are no longer truly rare events. The traditional idea of extreme weather happening once in a century is becoming outdated as climate patterns shift and such events occur more frequently. The idea of a 100-year storm once gave people a sense of comfort, as if nature itself had a predictable schedule that allowed humanity to plan, prepare, and feel safe in long stretches of normalcy. It suggested rarity, something so statistically distant that entire generations could live and die without witnessing it firsthand. But that sense of distance is beginning to collapse. What used to be framed as once-in-a-century events are increasingly appearing within decades, sometimes even within years, and that shift forces a deeper reconsideration of how risk is understood. At the core of this change is a warming and destabilizing climate system. Oceans that absorb excess heat are no longer passive reservoirs. They are becoming active engines of stronger storm formation. Warmer sea surfaces provide more energy for cyclones and hurricanes, allowing them to intensify faster than traditional forecasting models once expected. At the same time, atmospheric patterns are becoming less stable, creating conditions where storms do not follow historical paths with the same reliability. They drift, stall, and strengthen in ways that were once considered anomalies but are now appearing more frequently in weather records. This transformation is not just scientific data on a chart, it is reshaping how entire regions experience weather. Areas that were once considered safe from extreme storms are now finding themselves on updated risk maps. Coastal zones are seeing higher storm surges that push further inland than historical boundaries accounted for. River systems are overwhelmed by rainfall patterns that deliver months of precipitation in a matter of days. Even inland cities, far from oceans, are discovering that atmospheric moisture carried by shifting systems can produce devastating floods. What makes this especially concerning is the speed at which these changes are occurring, compared to the speed at which human infrastructure can adapt. Cities are built over decades, sometimes centuries, but climate conditions can shift significantly within a single generation. Drainage systems, housing developments, transportation networks, and energy grids were all designed based on historical climate data that is now becoming less reliable as a guide for the future. When a system is engineered for a once-in-a-century event, and that event begins occurring every 10 or 20 years, the system itself becomes outdated much faster than intended. There is also a growing psychological challenge in how people interpret these patterns. Humans tend to rely on memory and experience when judging risk. If someone has never personally experienced a catastrophic flood or storm, it is easy to assume it is unlikely to happen. But when records show increasing frequency, that gap between perception and reality becomes dangerous. Communities may delay preparation because the threat still feels abstract, even when the data clearly shows a rising trend. Insurance systems, emergency services, and government planning agencies are all trying to adjust to this new reality, but they are often reacting to changes rather than anticipating them. Recalibrating risk models takes time, and during that time exposure continues to grow. This creates a lag between what is known scientifically and what is implemented practically. Ultimately, the shift in how 100-year storms are understood is not just about weather terminology. It reflects a deeper transformation in the relationship between human systems and natural systems. Stability can no longer be assumed as the default condition. Instead, variability, extremes, and uncertainty are becoming central features of the environment that societies must now design around. Climate change is reshaping storm behavior. Rising ocean temperatures and changing atmospheric conditions are making storms more intense, unpredictable, and widespread in their impact. The most unsettling aspect of modern climate analysis is not that extreme storms exist, but that the boundaries defining them are shifting so quickly that even long-standing definitions are losing meaning. A 100-year storm was never meant to be a promise of timing. It was a statistical expression of probability. Yet over time it became something more emotionally concrete in the public mind, a rare, distant event that could be safely placed outside the urgency of daily planning. That perception is now under pressure, as new data reveals that the frequency and intensity of these so-called rare events are changing in real time. As global temperatures rise, the atmosphere behaves in ways that amplify instability. Warmer air holds more moisture, which increases the potential for heavy rainfall when storm systems form. At the same time, ocean warming fuels tropical cyclones with additional energy, allowing them to intensify more rapidly and maintain strength longer than previously recorded. These are not small adjustments in weather behavior. They represent fundamental shifts in the conditions that shape storms from their origin to their impact zones. One of the most critical changes is the way storms interact with geography. Historically, certain regions were considered relatively protected due to their distance from coastlines or their elevation above sea level. However, shifting jet streams and changing pressure systems are allowing storms to travel in unusual directions and maintain strength further inland. This means that areas once categorized as low risk are being re-evaluated, not because the land has changed, but because the atmosphere above it has. Another major factor is rainfall intensity. Modern storm systems are increasingly capable of releasing enormous amounts of precipitation in very short periods of time. This overwhelms natural drainage systems and human-engineered infrastructure alike. Rivers that once followed predictable seasonal cycles are now experiencing sudden surges that exceed historical flood records. Urban areas, with their dense surfaces and limited absorption capacity, are especially vulnerable to rapid flooding events that develop faster than emergency systems can fully respond. What makes this shift particularly challenging is that infrastructure development is inherently slow and expensive. Cities are not rebuilt every year, they evolve over decades. Roads, bridges, drainage networks, and coastal protections are all based on historical climate assumptions that may no longer apply. When a system designed for a certain level of risk is repeatedly exposed to conditions beyond that threshold, failure becomes not just possible but increasingly probable. At the same time, the human perception of risk struggles to keep pace. People tend to normalize recent experiences. If a major flood or storm has not occurred in living memory, it is often treated as unlikely, even if statistical models suggest otherwise. This creates a dangerous gap between scientific understanding and public urgency. The map of storm risk may show clear signals of increasing danger, but those signals must compete with the psychological comfort of past stability. Financial systems also feel this pressure. Insurance models, which rely on historical data to calculate risk, are being forced to constantly update their assumptions. As claims from extreme weather events increase, premiums rise, coverage becomes more restrictive, and in some areas, certain risks become uninsurable altogether. This has cascading effects on housing markets, development planning, and long-term economic stability. In this evolving landscape, the meaning of rare is changing. It no longer guarantees distance in time. Instead, it is becoming a moving target, influenced by global systems that are still being fully understood. The challenge ahead is not only to track these changes, but to adapt infrastructure, policy, and public awareness quickly enough to match the pace of transformation occurring in the atmosphere itself. Infrastructure is built on outdated assumptions. Cities, drainage systems, roads, and coastal defenses were designed for past climate norms, making them vulnerable to today's more extreme weather conditions. Across much of the world, infrastructure was designed with a simple assumption: the past is a reliable guide to the future. Engineers and planners looked at historical weather records, identified the most extreme events on record, and built systems to withstand slightly beyond those limits. Roads were elevated based on known flood levels, drainage systems were calibrated to handle maximum expected rainfall, and coastal defenses were constructed with reference to past storm surges. For a long time, this approach worked reasonably well because the climate itself was relatively stable within predictable bounds. But that stability is no longer guaranteed, and the foundation of those assumptions is beginning to show strain. The problem is not that infrastructure was poorly designed for its time. In fact, much of it was considered advanced and carefully engineered. The issue is that the baseline conditions are shifting faster than the infrastructure can be updated. When rainfall patterns intensify beyond historical records, drainage systems that once seemed sufficient suddenly become overwhelmed. Water that was expected to flow through controlled channels instead accumulates on roads, in basements, and across entire neighborhoods. What was once labeled extreme is increasingly becoming within expected range, forcing a complete rethinking of design standards. Bridges and transportation networks face similar challenges. Many structures were built with specific load expectations tied to historical environmental stressors. When storms become stronger and more frequent, the combination of wind pressure, water damage, and soil erosion places stress on systems that were never intended to experience such repeated extremes. Even small increases in intensity can have compounding effects over time, weakening materials, undermining foundations, and shortening the functional lifespan of critical infrastructure. Coastal cities are among the most exposed to these changes. Sea level rise, combined with more powerful storm surges, is pushing water further inland than previous generations anticipated. Barriers and seawalls that were once considered protective are now being tested more frequently and more severely. In some cases, they are overtopped or bypassed entirely during major storm events, revealing vulnerabilities that were not fully apparent under older climate conditions. The result is not just occasional flooding, but a gradual redefinition of what areas are considered safe for long-term settlement. Urban planning also struggles with these new realities. Cities expand based on zoning laws and environmental assessments that depend heavily on historical data. However, when that data no longer reflects current trends, new developments may unknowingly be placed in areas of increasing risk. Housing projects, commercial zones, and critical facilities such as hospitals and power stations can find themselves exposed to hazards that were underestimated during planning stages. There is also the challenge of maintenance and adaptation. Updating infrastructure is far more complex than building it anew. Retrofitting drainage systems, reinforcing bridges, or redesigning coastal defenses requires significant investment, coordination, and time. Meanwhile, extreme weather events continue to occur, sometimes causing damage before upgrades can be implemented. This creates a cycle where repair efforts are constantly chasing after evolving conditions. Perhaps most importantly, infrastructure is deeply interconnected. A failure in one system often triggers strain in others. A flooded road network disrupts emergency response. A damaged power grid affects communication systems. A compromised transportation hub can slow down recovery efforts across an entire region. These cascading effects highlight how modern societies rely on tightly linked systems that were all designed under similar historical assumptions. In this context, the challenge is not only technical but strategic. It requires moving from a mindset of building for known extremes to building for unknown variability. That means designing systems with flexibility, redundancy, and adaptability rather than fixed thresholds based on the past. The question is no longer whether infrastructure can handle yesterday's worst storm, but whether it can survive tomorrow's uncertainties. Extreme weather creates interconnected global risks. A single storm can disrupt supply chains, agriculture, energy systems, and economies far beyond the area where it hits. One of the most overlooked consequences of increasing extreme weather is how quickly it transforms from a scientific issue into a global economic one. A single powerful storm no longer remains confined to the place where it makes landfall. Instead, it ripples outward through supply chains, financial markets, energy systems, and food distribution networks. In an interconnected world, disruption in one region can produce measurable effects across continents, often within days. When a major storm strikes a coastal industrial hub, the immediate damage is visible. Flooded streets, damaged homes, disrupted transportation, and overwhelmed emergency services. But beyond that visible destruction lies a second layer of impact. Ports may close for weeks, halting the movement of goods that many industries depend on. Manufacturing plants that rely on just-in-time delivery systems can shut down if even a single component is delayed. This creates shortages that spread far beyond the affected region, influencing prices and availability in distant markets.